All right, hello everyone. I'm back again with Dr. Sean McFate. In the last episode, we discussed what Putin's next move might or will be. In this episode, we're going to discuss what NATO can do next in order to at least contain the situation. And there are a number of things. There's not only one thing, will be a number of options. So given the dynamic of what's going on in the ground, Sean, you had a recent article in The Hill that discussed at least a preliminary salvo at what can be done. I definitely have my own opinions, but I'll save that for after you kind of lay out
Sure.
what the options might be.
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, as time goes on, the sanctions will take their bite. And the sanctions are quite clever, and they're aimed at also the elite, not just the masses. Although we have to remember that sanctions are very blunt instruments. There's a saying, I used to live in Africa and do military work, though, shall we say. There's a saying in Africa I learned that when the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. And the grass, of course, is the people. So, we'll see that. But, let's not forget that, a lot of European countries and economies are very much invested in Europe, like Germany, Austria, France, Italy, Cyprus. And sanctions are a two-way street. So as the sanctions starve Russia, there'll also be a knock-on effect of starving those countries too, which could really erode political resolve of those countries to stick with the sanctions regime. So the sanctions it's not a one-shot deal. You got to kind of monitor it. The second thing is that President Biden has made it very clear and wisely, in my opinion, that we don't want American soldiers or troops on the ground in Ukraine. Because if there's a Russian versus American firefight, it can really escalate to a nuclear war. And that might sound preposterous to your listeners, but if there's any single law of warfare, it's the law of unintended consequences. And if you can think about like what happened in Serbia in 1914, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand leading to World War I, that can happen within 1 hour because of nuclear missiles. So I think Biden wants to keep Americans off the ground. So the real question is, what can NATO and the US do to get Russia out without putting troops on the ground? And we've already done, historic sanctions. So I think that is the question before us, Sean.
So what sorts of scenarios does the US, can they play? One is, obviously something that avoids helping the Ukrainians at all costs. So no, not saying no to a no-fly zone, not sending troops in or not sending proxy troops in, right? That could be one extreme. And then they just, kind of go with the economic sanctions and just try to bleed the Russians dry that way. Then there's, something that's a little in kind of the new rules for war, which is not looking at it as a war, but looking at it as, war, politics and war, peace and war at the same time.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. There are a number of options that the U.S. may have that way. What in your mind are those options?
So, again, I wrote this book called The New Rules of War in 2019, and it's actually being read right now in Kiev. I know, because I have Russian colonels asking me questions about certain rules. So here's what I would advise.
You mean Ukrainian colonels? You mean Ukrainian colonels?
Ukrainian colonels are asking. Yeah, they're in contact with me. Yeah, I have contact. I also teach at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., where we have, over the years, multiple Ukrainian colonels and general officers. So here's what I would do. I mean, this is a little different. I mean, first of all, look, you win by being sneaky, not by being strong alone. It's, David can beat Goliath. And it's not that, strength's important, but I think cunning goes further, especially in the 21st century in the information age. And we've seen how Russia has become a disinformation superpower. So the things that I'm thinking about and I'm proposing in my writings and my talk is that we should be sneaky. We used to be sneaky in the Cold War.
Sean, given the current conditions on the ground, what would you recommend that the US and NATO do?
Well, I recommend that we get sneaky. I think it's sneaky wins wars today, not just brute strength. And so what does this mean? Well, first of all, we have a surprise resistance on the ground. Let's keep it alive. But we can't use US soldiers, even covertly in Ukraine, because the risk of World War III is too high. So what we should do is we should base them on the borders of Romania or Hungary, right? So special forces, Green Berets, this is what they do for a living. They were started in the 1950s and 60s to create guerrilla movements against Russian. And that's what, and they're based in Fort Bragg. Let's put them out there. The CIA does this too, but the CIA, let's face it, they're all ex-Green Berets and SEALs anyway. So let's just give the mission to special forces and special operations forces. They can create like an insurgent base right across the border from Ukraine in Hungary or Poland or Romania. Insurgent groups can, or even just immigrants and refugees can go there. We can even link it with a refugee camp. And people who want to volunteer for the resistance can get training, equipping, intelligence, safe haven there. And when they're ready and we form, viable guerrilla units, they infiltrate back across and they start to build Western enclaves, just like the Russians built Eastern enclaves in the Donbass of Russian sphere. We'll do the same for the West of Ukraine. But we shouldn't just limit it at that. And of course, we should arm them with Stingers and Javelin and tank missiles. And, all they got to do, they don't have to destroy the Russian military. They just got to survive. So one of the oldest tricks in military strategy is you can win by not losing, right? I mean, think about General Washington in the American Revolutionary War. As long as his army was in the field, it was winning. It was a useless, terrible, scrappy little army that was half-starved, undersupplied, diseased. But as long as George Washington and the Continental Army were still at play, London could never say they had won. And that's what Washington did. So that's what, Zelensky or whoever, needs to do is if the resistance is alive, it is still, you've denied a victory condition to Russia. And for those who haven't seen it, you need to see one of my favorite movies is, oh my goodness, I'm forgetting it. It's, what Wolverines, that 1980s movie I'm thinking about?
Red Dawn.
Yeah, Red Dawn. I can't believe I spaced it. Not Red Dawn 2, which is a travesty. Red Dawn, about the great American insurgency against the Soviet invasion of the United States of America. Like shot in 1985 or something. I don't know when it was. But you can win. Yeah. Yeah.
And they also have the VDV colonel. And,
that's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So insurgencies win by not losing. And what they try to do is they try to protract the fight. They try to elongate it because as the longer it goes on, the more a fool Putin looks like. And that creates opportunities. It creates opportunities for us to approach Xi Jinping of China and say, you really don't want to be in business with this loser over here, right? We can work a wedge strategy because if we can separate China from Russia, that's a major win for the West. But we should also get more devious than that. So, we are the country that invented Hollywood, Madison Avenue, Twitter, Facebook, all these things. Why are we being outcommunicated by clumsy autocracies? Let's ourselves dabble in the dark arts of we don't even have disinformation. We can just have information. So if there's a way, for example, we could provide, pirate VPNs to people in Russia so they can Google whatever they want and let the truth do its work. That might be that would erode Putin's supply. I mean, his power base. Similarly, if you have, Russians hate seeing Russian soldiers coming home in body bags, that goes back to the Afghan war in the 1980s. If the insurgency can send, frankly, kill Russian soldiers and document it, which they've already begun doing, and make that known within Russia, you can get Russians asking Putin, like, is this really worth it? And we all know that Putin's not a democratically elected, dictator. He's a dictator, but he's still somewhat sensitive. I mean, in the 1980s, mothers of dead or missing Russian soldiers from Afghanistan created the first major anti-war protest in the USSR, and that really socked it to the Kremlin. Putin remembers that. We need to resurrect that. And then we should also just do fun things. Putin runs around half naked on a bear. Can't we do something with that? I mean, he uses a hang glider to help glide, like, I guess, swans to their nesting migration things. Let's ridicule that. I mean, we all know that dictators have they have sort of miniature egos. And then lastly, and this is like, there's other things, like he hates color revolutions, like the Orange Revolution. Let's start a few. Russia is an empire with, hundreds of years of animosity on its border from other republics. Let's prop them up, and then lastly, let's use covert means to, autocracies are very brittle. I thought they concentrate all their power at the top. And, at the top of that is a Putin autocrat who's actually kind of nervous about his life expectancy, because most autocrats have a violent death. They don't retire in peace, So can we not create the illusion that some of his lieutenants want to stage like a palace coup d'etat, so that he takes out his lieutenants for us? There's many ways to play this where some of the best weapons don't fire bullets. We have the capability, but we don't have the political will. And we need, because we don't take it very seriously. And this is the problem. It's the boiling the frogs, problem. We need to take it more seriously. We need to get more sneaky, like we were during the Cold War. And I think these things, whether it's a wedge strategy, China, Russia, manipulating, Putin's frame of mind, supporting the resistance, sanctions, all these in combination, this is what wins, not in a battlefield victory. It wins like, the Berlin Wall falling down one day in 1989 and a lot of the world being shocked. That's how you win modern war.
So let's go a little bit on the tactical level along with that theme. And I don't even know if I should be saying this stuff out loud, but I have a pretty devious mind. So there are three categories of things that Ukrainians can do. And in terms of, given when you're facing an overmatch in terms of conventional power, some of the tactics, techniques, and procedures that you can do. And these three categories are as follows. Number one, traditional sort of acts of sabotage, and I'll go through some examples. Number two, unconventional ways to use the Russians' own strengths against them. And then number three, these are if you want Western support, you should not do under any means, but were surprisingly effective in other conflicts. So in the first category, these things are more traditional, and you're seeing Ukrainians already doing some of these things. So, denying access to bridges by destroying bridges as the Russians come on. So these kind of scorched earth sort of tactics. The other thing is there's more elaborate ways to do that, to deny tanks access to certain areas. So there's a technique called, making an abattis sort of defense. And what that involves is if you see that big long line of tanks, there's trees on either side of the road, right? So if you attach an explosive, C4, whatever explosive you have, about a third of the way up those trees, they're going to collapse downward, and you have a nice crisscross that is impassable by tanks. Okay, so that's another thing you can do. There's also deception turrets and vehicles. So let's say you have two columns of Russian tanks advancing in parallel. you could put a deception turret in between and have them start to shoot at each other. Okay. There are obviously the normal tank traps and things like that that you can put in the way, which the Ukrainians are already doing. Similar to the caltrops, right? So there's, just like steel kind of crossed items you'd see on D-Day, right, as an example. And then you also have tank ditches, barbed wire, anything like that. So that's kind of, those are all, and then there's road cratering as well that you can do with explosives. There's a number of things like that that you can employ that are traditional and will slow down the Russian advance. Then there's more untraditional methods that, who knows. So this may be a little bit insensitive, but you'll understand where I'm coming from when I explain it. There's kind of the Baba Yar honeypot strategy, right? And every Ukrainians will understand what Baba Yar is. But what the Germans did when they were rounding up the Jewish population is they went around and said, if you want to go to Israel, show up to this spot, and we'll take you back to Israel, and you can establish Zion, etc. And every Jew who showed up got shot. So, using that idea, you could use Tinder. Have hot Ukrainian women, show themselves on Tinder. And then you just lure a bunch of Russian soldiers and you capture them. I'm not saying you kill them, but you capture them. You can even shame them, take their pictures, send them back to their mothers, show them, hey, this person, that your son was visiting a whorehouse and taking advantage of the locals, etc. So that's, one thing you can do. The other thing that you can do is you find a location that has Russian equipment and weapons, and you leak it to the press that that's where the Ukrainians are storing javelins. Then you have the Russians destroy their own equipment. So there are a number of things that you can do like that, and that's probably a little bit borderline, but there are a number of things like that that you can do to subvert the narrative and to fight. Now, the next series of things are the do not do at all, because the level of Russian response will be merciless. The Chechens did a number of these things, okay, particularly in the first Chechen War. So in the first Chechen War, snipers would aim at the groin because it would be humiliating, disfiguring, and a slow and painful death. Do not do that. The second thing they would do is they would get Russian dead and wounded and hang them upside down from the windows in any buildings that they occupied, so that the Russian troops would have to shoot their own to hit the Chechens. The third thing they did was at night, under the cover of darkness, they would take the heads of Russian soldiers and put them on stakes outside the entrance to the city, so that new Russian conscripts would see this sort of thing every time they walked in. So these are wartime atrocities. They're against the Geneva Convention. You do not do that. If you do that, you will lose Western support. But the Chechens did that, and that's kind of one reason they had won their brutality. The other thing that you can do, and again, you will lose Western support, is what the Chechens did subsequent to the 1999 leveling of Grozny, which is terrorism, right? There's the theater in Moscow. There's the Beslan incident. Not good. You don't want to be doing that sort of thing. So that said, there's plenty of opportunity for the middle ground, which is these unconventional tactics that use the Russian overmatch against themselves. Oh, the other thing, and the Ukrainians are already doing this. They're changing road signs and causing mass confusion and things like that. You could do that to devastating effect if you can have two Russian forces converge toward each other and put like a Ukrainian tank and just abandon it and let it sit there, and you could start a firefight. The Chechens actually did things like that. That's as long as you're not the one, causing that fight, that's totally fair game.
Well, rearranging road signs is something that the Russian Cossacks did against the Napoleonic invasion in 1812 as well. I mean, so that's the ironiest thing. But you're right. There's these two extremes, and they're both non-viable to win modern war. One is that you play like angels, and that doesn't work. Now you can do like counter mobility and stuff like that. You're talking about against tanks. Yes, that's true at the tactical level. But the play like angels to me is like the sort of the academics and lawyers in Geneva who are imagining war, but they've never smelled gun smoke. And, these are not the people who should be laying down the quote laws of war, right? I mean, it should be warriors who are doing this. And then that's kind of why nobody pays attention to the laws of war anymore, except for the US and the West. And then there's the other extreme, which is, that they lose all credibility by out disgusting the Russian disgusting. And, if Ukraine wants to survive as an insurgency, they need to keep this narrative of David versus Goliath. That's what they have to do. Because again, one of my rules, the new rules of war, is that some of the best weapons don't fire bullets. And one of them is the narrative of war, the narrative of why you're fighting, the narrative of what does victory look like. And this is how, the weak defeat the strong, whether it's, George Washington against the Redcoats, or it's, pick your battle, like where the little guy wins. Sometimes they do it by creating this narrative of they're just the underdog, and all they got to do to win is not die. And so it's like when a little league team plays the New York Yankees, all they've got to do is just not go, lose immediately, or lose by a huge amount. A little bit of fight can go a long way. So, but there is this middle ground. And I think one of the questions that you're raising really, and this is my work is really about the middle ground. How do you win in the middle ground? And we need devious strategists, not, look, if firearms were all it took to win wars, then we should have easily won against Al Qaeda and the Taliban. We had more bullets. So what's the problem? It's not just, it's a lot of other things too. So we need cunning strategists. And I believe that some of our, I believe in the Ratatouille rule. The movie Ratatouille, like Disney, the rat in Paris. So in this movie, it's about being a chef, right? Like a Parisian chef. And there's this rule that not everybody can be a great strategist, but a great strategist can come from anywhere. And right now, within the military bureaucracy and the political chum slick of Washington, D.C., which favors, it's like, fifth grade, clubs or whatever, cliques. Yeah, backstabbing. That environment is not going to produce strategic thinkers. We need to be open-minded. I used to love this book when I was a kid called Ender's Game, that was made into a movie. It's by Orson Scott Card.
Yeah. So for people who are listening to this, I have a story that's going to appear in an anthology with Orson Scott Card. It's called World's Long Lost.
Orson Scott Card's an amazing writer. Amazing writer. So he wrote this book in the 80s called Ender's Game, which is about how does a society spot and identify and train a strategist from a young age. And I don't know how to do that, but that's what we need. And I think one of the things we're going to have to really seriously rethink is the laws of armed conflict, the laws of war. So the current laws of war, like the Geneva Conventions, the Hague Conventions, and the protocols, they're all they came out of the 19th century, and they're all meant to regulate conventional war, which is state-on-state war, using militaries and sort of codes of honor. That type of warfare hasn't existed for 70 years, yet we still constrain ourselves by it. So there's an old saying in law, like you either bend law to fit reality, or you bend law, or you bend reality to fit the law. And I think we can't bend reality to fit the law. So we have to update the laws of armed conflict so they reflect modern warfare. They reflect war in the information age. They reflect all these things we've seen since 1945. Meanwhile, we're stuck like, a mosquito locked in Jurassic amber about what what war should be. So, one of the reasons we're stuck in this laws of war paradox is because the people who are in charge are not the people who have to fight. And so you have moral hazard in the lawmaking here. And until we correct that, we will never do well. And the West, that's a Western problem because, Russia, China, Iran, terrorists, they've all blown by this.
Right.
They've all moved past us.
Well, even
and we were
even the Russians and the Ukrainians are taking pictures of prisoners, and they're not supposed to be doing that according to the law, Geneva Convention.
The Geneva Convention is as up to date as like a horse-drawn carriage, right? I mean, so we need to stop being paradigm prisoners of that. And the first question people ask, is it legal? My answer is it strategic? Let's not relegate strategy to lawyers, and not just any lawyers, but these soft law lawyers, the human rights crowd, the laws of armed conflict crowd. These are not people who have any skin in the game. If you want to use the laws of armed conflict to mitigate human suffering, then let's update it. It's about 120 years behind the times. And this, and we have to be more, that goes hand in hand with, we have to be more devious, frankly.
All right. There's one last place or two last places I want to go, but we're going to wrap up pretty soon. What is, aside from doubling down, what is the face-saving exit for Vladimir Putin?
Yeah. So this is a great question, is that this is what Scipio Africanus would call the Golden Bridge. So Scipio Africanus was a great Roman general
in the
Second Punic Wars against Hannibal. And, he was greater than Napoleon, in my opinion. I mean, we forget because it was a long time ago, but he always said, provide your enemy with a golden bridge to retreat, but you would manipulate that. You'd create a situation where if you can imagine rats in a maze, you create the off ramp to go exactly where you want it to go, but they make the choices and you kind of manipulate those choices. So how can we create a golden bridge for Putin to back down, yet not press the nuclear red button? Right. And I think that's a cunning strategist has to think about that today. And so the question is, what is he willing to live with Ukraine that is not like Georgia today? Right. We would not, could we enter Ukraine into the EU, but not NATO? Could we have, that is one thing. I don't think that there's a scenario where, he would say, okay, I will leave, but it's going to be, my puppet regime under my foreign policy, but they have autonomy within their territory to regulate domestic law. That might be something. I don't think he's going to go for that. I think what we are going to have to do is we have to protract this for 4 or 5 years until a point where his economy is savaged. Ukraine is clearly not going to go away, but it's neither he's going to win or they're going to win. And then we can bring Russia to the table, and Ukraine will have a voice. We can't tell Ukraine you can't join NATO. It's up to Ukraine and NATO for that. But I think this is going to take, we've just put Putin into a vat of acid, and we've got to let time go on until he's in bad shape with flesh and tendons dangling on the bones to entice him into the golden bridge of our choosing. And we have more strategic patience than he does, barring a presidential election.
All right, and last piece. Given what's going on today, if it extends long into the spring, well, I'll start a little bit. One concern I have is kind of what are the ripple effects, and the one that concerns me, I wouldn't say the most, but concerns me, is while the EU will be fine with any disruption to agriculture, because as we all know, that Ukraine used to be the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. I'm concerned about the impact it will have, particularly on the Middle East and Africa. Turkey, as an example, I don't have the exact numbers, but I think it's anywhere between 60 and 90% of its grain or wheat, one or the other, right, that it imports, comes from, about 2/3 of that comes from Russia, and another third comes from Ukraine. The Middle East also is very dependent on that supply from Ukraine. I think Ukraine also produces half the maize or corn in Europe. So I'm sure that's not a huge issue for Europeans, but I'm worried that we're going to see another bout of instability in the Middle East and Africa as a result of this war. Fast forward about a year from now.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's correct. I think that, again, like I said, the only law of conflict is really the law of unintended consequences. And I think the ripple effects, well, there's going to be refugee effects in Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. And we know that drives up like neo-Nazi regimes.
It's already 1 million. Right? It's 1 million and counting right now. And I think they think it could be as high as 5, right?
There is a lot of, in my opinion, there's some racism going on too. Like, there's a higher tolerance for white war refugees and other war refugees. But refugees, drains on economies in Hungary, Poland, Romania, places like that, refugee camps. I mean, that is going to take a toll. The economic drain for countries that are pretty invested in Russia, like, again, Germany, France, Italy, Austria, Cyprus, those, that will impact that domestic political situation, and they will tell their political leaders, let's back off of the US's crazy horse stuff. Mm-hmm. And you'll start to see maybe even the NATO alliance, erode a little bit. And then there's food security issues in the Middle East. And the Middle East, we all know that conflict and resource problems can spark, wars. And we've seen a lot of that in the past. And I think, the Middle East economies, depending where you are not that great. There's a lot of places in the Middle East which are pretty unstable. There's still Afghanistan, which is, doesn't get a bread basket. Yeah, they're starving, and that's places in the world like Yemen, Libya, Afghanistan. They're time bombs, right? And so there's a lot of ways this whole thing can go sideways in the third and fourth order effects. That if you move back from the current Ukrainian flag waving of the moment, could have some dire consequences, and we need to think through these strategies. And also, frankly, could stuff like this be, fodder for the U.S. midterms in 2022? And so there's a lot going on. And also, what might Xi Jinping do? I mean, that's a big independent variable. Can we drive a wedge between Xi Jinping and Russia? Could that backfire? People are talking about Taiwan and stuff like that. But let's also remember that China is very busy digesting Hong Kong still, and there's a lot of saber rattling going on. But that could all go sideways as well. So it's fraught times. If we focus on worst case scenarios, but I think the things that you're talking about, like food security and refugee issues, I think those are very real and should be expected.
Now, there is one offset to countries in the Middle East that have have incomes that are principally derivative of the oil industry, right? So the higher price of oil will be somewhat of an offset. But for those countries that are kind of in the middle, that don't really have a burgeoning oil industry, there could be some issues. The other thing, and I haven't looked at the numbers, I'd be curious how much grain or wheat that the Chinese import from Ukraine.
Sure.
Right. They'll be fine with Russia, but will there be some sort of disruption? Because if there's one thing that kind of the Chinese do not need, it is, given they have much higher male to female ratios, given the cultural, longstanding mandate of heaven that they only reign by virtue. Their biggest threat is their own internal instability, which is why Xi Jinping has always been focused on growing the economy, making sure people had jobs. That goes away, and he has a massive internal problem.
We'll also remember, like, Belt Road Initiative kind of goes through a lot of these places. And there's a lot of hyperbole around China's strength, but I think it's actually quite brittle, as you mentioned. And also, let's not forget that China and Russia have 1,000 years of animosity, enmity between each other, and they both look down each other. They view the only rival they have is the United States of America, and that each other is a secondary rival. And so we'll see how this realpolitik, deal between Putin and Xi plays out over time. But I think you're correct. I mean, China, its strategic interest may not be fully aligned with Russia's, and that doesn't mean it's fully aligned with the US. Yeah.
In the short term, it's great for China because it's sucking us and our resources into a war that, not a war, but into a conflict or potential conflict that we don't need, or we don't have strong interests other than to protect an alliance on a piece of paper, right? And that's great for China because we take our eyes off that ball, that great trans-Pacific shift. So
that's right.
That's the short term, yeah. But the long term, good. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, I mean, China has strategic patience. I mean, one of the things about autocracy is they have strategic patience, and in China's case, their goal is to be the regional hegemon of Asia by 1 October 2049. So they have between 2022, right? That includes everything in the Pacific. They want to move us out. We can still be hegemon, but not of Asia. That's their domain. They have their own Monroe Doctrine. And, long term, what Russia is doing really can get in the way of that. And they have strategic vision. So again, like you say, the short term, it's convenient. But I think that in Beijing, they're a little worried about where this might lead, especially if, worst case scenario, Putin pops off a tactical nuke someplace, even on Russian territory, to send the signal to the world. I mean, that's not good for the Chinese economy, however you look at it. So I'm not suggesting that there's going to be some grand alliance between the US and China. There probably won't be. But again, the US needs to find a wedge strategy to separate and create daylight between Russia and China, maybe not in the near term, but in the mid to long term. And if we could do that, I think we'd be well on our way to, things will be stable. I mean, I don't want to be cautiously optimistic, as I say in DC.
Well, but, three party antagonist systems are inherently unstable by their very nature.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's actually right. Yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, Sean, once again, thank you very much for your insight and your review of what's going on. And hopefully we're both wrong, at least on the bad stuff, and we're right about the good stuff. But we'll see what happens in the next coming weeks and days. So
okay,
I'll talk to you soon.
Let's reconvene and see where we are and whenever a good period is. But yeah, let's see if we've hopefully we're wrong, as you say, about some of these things. But I think hopefully we're right about some of these things too. So
yeah,
take care.
All right, my friend. Talk to you soon.
All right, take care.